Welcome to the Radiant Visalia podcast. Join us at one of our two services, 9 a.m. and 10:45 a.m. Download the Church Center app or visit our website, radiantvisalia.com, to stay connected with us. All right, enjoy.
There is a heavenly city that I'm compelled to find.
If you've got a Bible, you can turn to Revelation chapter 2. The book of Revelation is at the very end. Good news for you. You don't got to find your way somewhere to the middle of that big book. Get to the end, get to the book of Revelation, get to chapter 2. I'm going to read starting in verse 8. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, "These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death." What makes a good church? In your opinion, what makes a good church? How do you know that a church is a good church? How do you measure that? I know for some, we'll get the feedback, a good church is a church that teaches and believes the Bible. Maybe that's your criteria. That's good criteria. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that's atop the totem pole for some. For some, it's, they love each other well. What is it for you? When you walk into a church and you're like, is this a good church? What are the things that you're looking for in order to determine if a church is a good church? They have fog machines. They don't have fog machines, right? The pastor's funny. Sorry, that wasn't funny. Everyone was laughing, and then it was like, oh, okay, now you're making fun of me. They pray. They serve. They speak with tongues. They don't speak with tongues. That's a good church. None of that tongue talk. What makes a good church? This is the question we've been asking as we study the 7 letters to the churches in Asia Minor. These 7 letters that are recorded in the first few chapters of Revelation. We're studying these letters. These are the words of Jesus to his church, and we think answer the question, what makes a church a good church? What you like is important. What other people think, that's important too. Ultimately, not nearly as important as what Jesus thinks about his church, his bride, what he thinks makes a good church. So in this culture and at this moment in history, it can be really tempting because we are individuals, right? I was thinking about how individualistic we've become, thinking about how the army used to recruit. The army used to recruit by just saying, Uncle Sam needs you. And that was enough to go die in a desert because people understood citizenship. We don't understand that anymore. So now Uncle Sam recruits by telling you you can be all that you can be. And you're like, yeah, that's enough to go die in a desert. It's not funny either, apparently. 0 for 2. Back to the notes then. It's really tempting to think at this cultural moment, because we're good consumers. We're good at that. It can be tempting to think that a good church is a church that can offer a lot of things. They can offer a lot of things. They can offer a lot of services and then demand very little from their people. That's a good church. A church that can offer many things, that can offer much but demand little from you. That can become the measure of a good church. Am I right? It's tempting for me. I wish I could offer much and demand little. I don't like that we have to receive an offering. I wish we could just say, we've got it. I'll bankroll it. I wish I could. I wish we didn't have to put demands on your time. That we could just offer you services to consume and demand little from you. Jesus praises with his own mouth a church that could offer very little but demanded much from its members. The church in Smyrna could offer very little and demanded everything. And Jesus has nothing but praise for this church. Oh, this is good. I love this. The church has so little to offer in terms of parking or kids programs. Smyrna didn't have a VBS to offer you. And the demands of converting and belonging to this community were potentially your life. You were being threatened with physical violence. There were not many perks to joining the church in Smyrna. No rebuke for this church that we read about today. Only praise because they endured. And when we suffer, right? So easy to compromise and quit. And these people, they endured. And they were suffering, get this, they were suffering because they were unwilling to compromise. If they were willing to compromise a little more, they would have suffered a little less. But this church was unwilling to compromise, even when they were in a time of suffering. I hate working out. Like now at this point, worse than dieting. They used to it's like a toss-up. Now it's not. I'd rather eat right than work out. I hate it. I actually like it until it starts to burn. I'm like, yeah. And then I'm like, no. And I will find some other weird way to do the exercise when it begins to hurt. I'll compromise my form. My push-ups, my butt's this high in the air because it's starting to do what a push-up was supposed to do, and I'm out. When we suffer, when we hurt, when we face pain, we compromise. And this church was uncompromising. They didn't change their form in order to make it easier or that it would burn less. Let me read you an amazing story. This is about the martyrdom of Polycarp, who was the bishop of the church in Smyrna. This is in AD 156. Many people believe that Polycarp was a disciple of John, the very man who got the revelation that we're reading here this morning. Polycarp's the bishop. On February 2nd, we read that he had fled from the city. Things had gotten so difficult in Smyrna that he had fled. The congregation was begging him, please go, please leave, there's going to be trouble for you. So he fled, and he was tracked down in his hiding place, and he made no attempt to flee when they tracked him down. And instead, he offered food and drink to his captors. And he asked permission to retire for prayer. And he did so for 2 hours before they hauled him off. And then as they traveled into the city, the officer in charge was urging him to recant, saying, "What harm can it do to sacrifice to the emperor? Just sacrifice, just compromise, just sacrifice to the emperor, and this all will end." And Polycarp refused. And on arrival he was roughly pushed out of the carriage and brought before the proconsul in the amphitheater, who addressed him and said, "Respect your years." This is an 86-year-old man. "Respect your years. Swear by the genius of Caesar. And again, swear, and I will release you. Revile Christ," is what Polycarp was charged to do. To which Polycarp replied, "For 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me?" And the proconsul persisted, "Swear by the genius of Caesar. I have wild beasts. If you will not change your mind, I will throw you to them." "Call them," Polycarp replied. "Since you make light of the beasts, I will have you destroyed by fire unless you change your attitude." Angry Jews and Gentiles then gathered wood for the pile. Polycarp stood by the stake, asking not to be fastened to it. And he prayed, "O Lord, Almighty God, the Father of your beloved Son, Jesus Christ, through whom I have come to know you, I thank you for counting me worthy this day and hour of sharing the cup of Christ, to be among the number of your martyrs." The fire was lit, but the wind drove the flames away from him and prolonged his suffering. So a soldier put an end to his misery with a sword. Man. When we're suffering, we find out what we're made of, yeah? Pain and suffering have a refining effect. We find out who and what we're in this for. Polycarp seemed pretty clear that he was a citizen, that he'd entered a covenant. If you grew up in the church, no doubt you've heard stories like this, right? The missionary comes and tells us about those who are facing even the threat of physical death and are, under that type of pressure, refusing to renounce Jesus. And we've all done what when they come and when we hear those stories? We've all just wondered, would I be able to stand? Would my faith be able to hold up? Could I do something like what Polycarp did? What would happen in that moment when I came under that type of pressure? Anyone ever wondered that? Right? When you're faced with suffering, you find out what people really believe. And if we want to get the final word, we jokingly say to people, if I put a gun to your head, is this what you would say? When faced with death, what would you decide? And this church in Smyrna was still siding with Jesus even when faced with death. They were still siding with Jesus even when they were suffering. And I found myself just personally really inspired this week as I came to understand what this church was facing and then what Jesus was saying to them. So what is it for you? I mean, I'm guessing there's a short list of people or ideas that you would be willing to take a bullet for. What is that for you? According to Jesus, if a church is going to be a living church a lasting church, it must learn to love well. We read that last week when we studied the church in Ephesus. If a church is going to be a living church, if it's going to be a lasting church, that church needs to be a loving church, and it needs to love Jesus. That's what we studied when we studied the church in Ephesus. But this week we're going to find out that if a church is going to be a living church, if it's going to be a lasting church, then it's going to have to learn to suffer well. In Acts 16, I was thinking about this story. Acts 16 is the record of a church being planted. And the church is planted when some things happen. You've probably read some of these stories, but Paul comes to town, and when he comes to town, he bumps into Lydia, I believe it is. And it says that she's a God-fearer, and all Paul needs to do with Lydia is just invite her to church, and she's down to come because she knows something of God and isn't resistant to church. And then the next person Paul bumps into and decides to plant the church with is this slave girl who is demon-possessed. And it actually says that Paul ends up getting so annoyed that he casts demons out of this gal. And then when he casts demons out of this girl, she's no longer a slave and can no longer be of service to those who own her. And this is what happens in Acts 16. When her owners realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. They brought them before the magistrates and said, "These men are Jews and are throwing our city into uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us as Romans to accept or practice." The crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods. And after they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When they received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in their stocks. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once all the prison doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose. The jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself. We're all here." And the jailer said, "Turn on the lights." And he rushed in, and he fell trembling before Paul and Silas. And he then brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all the others in his house. At that hour of the night, the jailer took them and washed their wounds. Then immediately he and all his household were baptized. The jailer brought them into his house and set a meal before them. He was filled with joy because he'd come to believe in God, he and his whole household. Paul plants this church with a Lydia who just needs to be invited to church. And then he plants this church with a slave girl who just needs to be served. But this Roman jailer needed something else. No doubt this Roman jailer had heard the message and was indifferent to what Paul and Silas had to say. This Roman jailer was converted when he saw how well these men suffered and the kindness that they extended to him. This cynical jailer was converted when he saw these men suffer. That's what did it for him. You don't get to the Roman jailer by just saying, "Come to church." They're too cynical for that. They'll sit in the back and be like, "Why is everyone working themselves up into a frenzy? We all know this isn't real." They can't be served. They're too proud. We don't need anything. But these cynics are converted when they see a church that suffers well and extends kindness. We have to learn as a group, if we're going to reach people, we have to learn to suffer well. We have to learn to extend kindness. According to Jesus, if we're going to be his church, we can't just do things for people. We have to demand things from people. And if we're going to be a living church, a lasting church, a Jesus church, we need to learn to suffer well and extend kindness. So how is this church suffering? What was their trouble? What was their trial? Well, there's a few things. The statement, Jesus is Lord, had gotten them in trouble with Rome. Jesus is Lord got them in trouble with Rome. Jesus is God got them in trouble with the Jews. This title, Lord, was reserved for Caesar, and the question rose, is Caesar Lord or is Christ Lord? And Smyrna, this city we're reading about, had a reputation of being incredibly patriotic and loyal to Rome. No city loved Rome like Smyrna loved Rome. Smyrna felt it owed a great debt to Rome for resurrecting the city. In about AD 25, there was a bunch of cities in this region, and they were all competing with one another for the prize of erecting a temple to Emperor Tiberius. And guess who won? Smyrna. Because Smyrna loves Rome. Smyrna is a hotbed for emperor worship. It's a super patriotic place. The problem that Rome had with such a vast empire is, how do we unite this vast empire? What do we do to hold this thing together? It was so diverse, so large, that they struggled to keep it together. A unified religion, a unified language, impossible. Too many races, too many people groups. But the Pax Romana, it had the power to unite. The spirit of Rome. Think of the American dream. The Pax Romana, the spirit of Rome, had the power to unite this empire. One guy smarter than me writes this: this was the Roman peace. The person under Roman sway found himself in a position to conduct his business, provide for his family, send his letters, and make his journeys in security thanks to the strong hand of Rome. The seas were cleared of pirates. The great Roman roads were cleared of brigands. Men no longer lived under the capricious rule of unaccountable tyrants, but under the control of strict and impartial Roman justice. It was not difficult to turn the spirit of Rome into a power which men were gratefully willing to worship. There's obviously some vagueness in worshiping the American dream, right? There's some vagueness in worshiping the spirit of Rome. But there was one person who incarnated or embodied that spirit, and that was the emperor. The spirit of Rome took on a visible form in the emperor. So emperor worship arose. And here's what this looked like. Once a year, a Roman citizen had to burn a pinch of incense at the bust of a statue of Caesar. Once a year, one pinch of incense at the bust of a statue of Caesar. That's what you were required to do. Every Roman citizen had to perform this duty and then receive a certificate. I did my duty as a citizen of Rome. The burning of this pinch of incense was not a test of a person's religion. It was a test of their political loyalty. In fact, Rome was pretty kicked back when it came to religion. Whatever. Worship your gods. Just make sure that Caesar is one of them. So you just had to come to the bust once a year, sprinkle your incense, receive a certificate, because you'd done your duty as a Roman citizen. Just a pinch, right? Come on. Just a pinch, just once a year. Just get this over with. Then we'll be free to worship Jesus. We'll get them off our backs. We'll do our thing. Well, these Christians wouldn't do it. They would give to no man the name of the Lord. That was reserved for Christ alone. So they were seen as traitors, right? Jesus is God got them in trouble with the Jewish community. I think it's important to notice in this passage that this caused trouble with some Jews who were not Jews. And I just want to say from the outset, Jews did martyr Polycarp, and Jews did some horrible things to Christians. Christians have in turn done some horrible things to Jews. And there is no place for anti-Semitism in the church or the Christian understanding. So this is not grounds for that. That's not what you're reading here. But Smyrna had a huge population of Jewish people, and the Jews were given exemption from emperor worship. They didn't have to participate. They didn't have to bring their pinch to the bust of Caesar. They got out of it. As long as they didn't stir up trouble in the city, they were free to worship Yahweh. Some of the Christians who had converted were Jews. Some of the Christians that converted were Gentiles. And what we think happened here is that the Christians began to claim exemption from emperor worship based on their connection to Judaism. They tried to get in line with them. No, we're just a sect of that. We're just the Nazarenes. It's almost like someone has a place of priority in line, and you try to cut in with them, and they go, man, get out of here because you're going to cost me my place in line. The Christians were trying to get in on this exemption that the Jews had. The Jews feared that they were going to lose what they had in the city of Smyrna, and so they began to slander the Christians, to make up all kinds of things about them, so that everyone knew that these were two separate groups. The Christians were trying to get in on what the Jews had. The Christians were seen as a threat to the peaceable way of life that they had. So slander was happening. The other trouble that they were having was poverty. They were poor, and there's two words used in Greek to describe poverty. One of the words is used to describe the working poor, essentially the type of poverty where a man has nothing extra. And there's a second definition in Greek, which is a man has nothing at all. They're destitute. This is the word that was used to describe this church. They were destitute. That could have been because the Christian religion appeals to the poor, it appeals to the marginalized, so maybe that's what made up the church there. It could have been that those who did have status, did have power, did have a job, lost those things because they became Christians. Essentially, they got Colin Kaepernicked because they wouldn't stand and they wouldn't do the things that needed to go on. Is that too much? You still all right? Did I lose anybody? The charge here, the charge to this church is to not be afraid. Difficult when we're suffering, right? To not be afraid is the charge, and to be faithful. To be faithful. To be full of faith. But it's difficult to be full of faith in a time of suffering, is it not? And so, Jesus provides them with 7 reasons. These are 7 reasons you should be full of faith and not be afraid. Because we all know it gets super tempting when we're suffering to begin to compromise. Hence my push-ups. You can start to ask the question, is this worth it? That's what I do when I'm working out. That's what I do when I'm dieting. I don't know if this is worth it. Is this worth it? When you begin to face real challenges, you begin to ask the question, is this worth it? And I'm sure this church was asking the question, look, we're dying here. Is Jesus worth it? And I think the description of Jesus found here in Revelation 2 is amazing. And these are reasons why we should trust Jesus in times of suffering. These are reasons we can be full of faith when facing opposition and persecution. The first is that he's eternal. These are the words of him who is the first and the last. Anytime we're trying to figure out the value of something, we ask ourselves the question, does this have any staying power? Is this just a trend? Or am I paying into something, giving myself to something that has staying power? And I love in the face of that question of, is this a fad? Is this worth it, Jesus? Jesus says, it's worth it. I've got staying power. I'm the first and the last. I was the Alpha before you were born, and I'll be the Omega after you're dead. My kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. I'm eternal, and I'm giving you eternal life. This is the promise that Jesus makes. So don't be afraid. The second thing he says, I'm victorious, who died and came to life again. He's our resurrected King. We, as the church, can be faithful unto death because he was faithful unto death. He's the one who's taken the sting of sin and death. The one who is living, who holds the keys of death and hell. He's the victorious one, and this is the reminder. This is interesting because this just, I think, would have meant something to this church. The city of Smyrna, which is modern-day Izmir. We actually have friends here who are from Izmir. Can you raise your hand? Sorry, man. I don't know if you want to be the guy from Izmir, but that's what you are now. I know you. You're the guy from Izmir. Smyrna. If anything I'm saying is not right, I give you permission to publicly correct me. No one else has that, though. Smyrna was known as the city that died and came back to life. The city that was rebuilt from the ruins. It just had this way of surviving and being rebuilt, and it's the only city that still stands to this day. All the other ones we're going to read about no longer inhabited, but Smyrna is. And they had this pride in the fact that their city had been crushed but had been resurrected. We're from the city that died but came back to life again. We turned this thing around. That's what we want in Tulare, and then we're just going to be so proud. The downtown of Tulare, we turned it around, and Smyrna was proud in that way. And I just love that Jesus is like, all right, you can put your hope in a city if you want, and its power and its status and what it can provide you with. The wealth of this city, it was a wealthy place. Or you can put your hope in me. You can put your hope in the city that died and came back to life, or you can put your hope in a resurrected King who defeated death and sin. The third thing he says to this suffering church, which I think brings tremendous comfort, is I know. He knows. I know your afflictions. I know your poverty. I know enough about it to use the second Greek word that's destitute. I know what's going on there. Yet you're rich. I know about the slander. I actually know what people are saying about you. Pastors seek out pastors because they want somebody who knows. Like, you know what I'm talking about. My wife has been on the hunt. I need to find another mom. And I said, well, there's hundreds of other moms. No. I need to find another mom with 5 kids. Okay, well, there's a few of those. No. I need to find another mom with 5 girls. Okay, well, this is getting smaller. And is a pastor's wife. Okay, I mean, good luck with that search. You might find someone. When she finds someone, she won't find someone who can fix her problems. She'll find someone who sits down with her, looks her in the eyes, and goes, I know and it'll bring tremendous comfort to her. And here is Jesus saying to you, saying to me, saying to this church, I know what's going on, and I can bring comfort to you. Especially when it comes to slander. There's nothing worse than people making things up about you. And how gratifying is it when a friend comes alongside of you and essentially says, I know that's not true. I know that's not true about you. Oh, it's just like, thanks, man. At least somebody thinks I'm telling the truth. You know, you can imagine this church going, they're making up all kinds of things about us that are not true. We're not suffering for what we did. We're suffering for things that were made up about us. That's so rough. And Jesus says, I know about that slander. I know it's not true. And it would have brought comfort to the church just as it brings comfort to us. The fourth thing Jesus would remind us, so that we can be full of faith in him when we're suffering, is that his thoughts are not our thoughts. His thoughts are not your thoughts. I shouldn't have to unpack this. I mean, no one disagrees with me right now, right? You know this. This is why you're here, trying to sync up your thoughts with his. I know your afflictions, your poverty, yet you are rich. And I can imagine the church being like, yeah, bro, well, hey, look, we're a lot of things. Rich is not one of those things. You don't know. You don't know. Yeah, he does know. His thoughts are not your thoughts, and he measures things a little differently than you do. And we know what this is like, right? We all know what it's like. If you've been to a third world country, you go to those countries, and they have nothing, and you wish you had what they had. They have nothing, and you were like, I wish I had that. That joy, that sense of contentment. And you're looking at them like, man, you're rich. I didn't come here thinking that, but I'm leaving here understanding that you're rich. And they're like, you pray, you preach. And I'm like, I have nothing. I have nothing. I don't know anything. I just have a bigger book budget than you do. Don't make me preach. Don't make me be the guy who prays. I feel poor in this place, and I want what you have. And this is what Jesus is saying to this church. We've experienced this. You guys are rich. Another reason you should put your faith in Jesus when you're suffering is that he's honest. He's honest. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. It is going to happen. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. He's straight up concerning suffering. He's straight up. The evangelist might not have been when he called you to follow Jesus. The pastor might not have been straight up concerning the difficulty and the suffering that you'll face. But you can trust Jesus because he's painfully straight up when it comes to suffering. You will have trouble when you face trials, not if, because you live in one of those countries. When you face trials, he's so straight up. You're going to suffer. And I don't know what it is about me, but I always forget that. And then I always come back to this passage in Peter that says, beloved, don't be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. I love that. I think that's my life verse. That's coffee cup material. Any seniors? Get that on your Letterman's jacket. Because I'm always like, surprised, you know? I mean, he's so straight up. It's going to be rough. They hated me, they're probably going to hate you. Why do they hate me? I told you they're going to hate you. No. Seriously, Jesus. He is honest when it comes to suffering. You will suffer. You will face trouble. You will face trial. He's honest. He never offered you an easy way. He never offered you an easy out. He told you that you could take up your cross and follow him. That means that you'll die daily. One more reason is that he's purposeful. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you'll suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I'll give you life as your victor's crown. The devil is testing, right? The devil's trying to test you. The devil's putting you in prison because the devil intends to break you. He wants to destroy you. He has a purpose in your pain as well. But Jesus also has a purpose in our suffering. God has a plan in it. And seeing the so that in suffering is essential. 1 Peter 1 says, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief and all kinds of trials, these have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold. See, this is the test not to flunk, but the test to refine. That God's looking to test so that, here's Peter connecting your suffering to your sanctification. If you don't have this, you won't make it. If you can't see any purpose in the pain that you're facing, you won't make it to the other end of it. And Peter's like, connect your suffering to your sanctification so that your faith, so that the proven genuineness of your faith of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus is revealed. Pain can teach us things nothing else can teach us. We reject it every time like some crummy substitute teacher. Like, really, what do you have for us today? Lion King? But pain can teach us things. This is bad. Pain can teach us things that nothing else can teach us. Nothing clarifies your values quite like pain. Nothing will change direction quite like pain. And I think there needs to be, especially for us, we love comfort. You need to understand pain. We need to understand, sorry for talking at you. We need to understand that pain is not the worst thing in the world. What you do and where you go with your pain is the worst thing in the world. Where you hide, how you cop out, what you do in pain can be the worst thing in the world. Pain can produce some amazing things. And God's purposeful with our pain. And then the last thing, the last reason Jesus says, hey, be full of faith in me when you're suffering is because I'm generous. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I'll give you life as your victor's crown. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. Be faithful even to the point of death. If you're faithful, you will escape the hell, which is the second death. And you will have the heaven that is the crown of life. The victor's crown. And I love this because this promise here is that, yeah, your following Jesus will include a cross for a time, but it also includes a crown. You will be rewarded. And I think this just, too, reflects how honest Jesus is about the human condition. I mean, he just says, I will reward you and I am generous. And he understands that we don't do anything without incentives. I think some people think that we should just do things because they're the right thing to do. Like every time I'm telling my kids there's a reward for that chore, there's like a tension in me where I'm kind of like, no, you should just do this because it's the right thing to do. And then I'm like, but I'll totally hook you up with some ice cream if you clean your room. And I struggle between the two. And I'm thinking, they shouldn't need a reward to do this. This is just part of being an Aikland, right? Well, Jesus is way more realistic than you are about the human condition. And he's like, no, they don't do anything without rewards. There has to be a payoff for these people. This has to be incentivized. There's no doing it just because it's the right thing to do. No one does things because it's the right thing to do. Jesus knows this. He knows the condition of our hearts. And he's like, no, there's a payoff, dude. It's going to be sweet. And I'm generous. I am generous. And you can get the crown. I loved this. I read this week. It said, you can die in order to live, or you can live in order to die. I believe this passage is a charge for us in some ways, and then is not a charge for us in other ways. This is a charge for us to not be afraid. There's suffering going on. Is it Spurgeon who said there's difficulty included in everything except eating pancakes? Everyone here is suffering to some degree. I get it. And here's the charge. Here's the general principle. Don't be afraid and don't compromise. Be faithful. Be faithful. I think I found myself at times thinking like, I believe in good news. Why is this good news so difficult to declare? And then why do people seem so resistant to it? If this is so sweet and we're getting this excited about it, why isn't it having a bigger impact than it is in our city? And just questioning things kind of can lead to some compromise, you know? And I was just thinking about this charge to be faithful to the gospel message, which can be increasingly difficult. Anybody finding it increasingly difficult to be faithful to the message that we've been given? Here's why. If you're wondering, like, why isn't this working? Why aren't people more into this? Why aren't people as into this as I'm into this? Declaring the gospel message includes talking to people about the doctrine of sin. That's never going to be that popular. If you're waiting for that to get cool, you're going to be waiting a while. We then have to talk about the reality of God's coming judgment. That goes over well. Then you have to tell people you can't save yourself. There's no self-saving. That's easy to say. Then we have to talk about the necessity of the cross. Just foolishness. Then we have to talk about eternal life, not as something you earn by being a good person, but it's freeness. It's free. And it's like, what? And then we talk about this second death. And it's like, by the end of it, it's like, man, this is difficult. It can be difficult to remain faithful to this message because these truths undermine our pride and they arouse opposition. So be faithful and fear not. And maybe as I read this week, another thing I would say to you is just like stop with the like, it's never been darker than this. They took the 10 Commandments out of school or whatever it is. Like, the more I get to know about church history, the more I get to know about the dark days that the church has endured. I think we're living in some pretty lush pastures when the newspaper reports not slander, but life's coming back to downtown Tulare. We can walk around like, oh, it's so bad, it's so bad, it's so bad. And I found myself this week in understanding what this church was going through, going, oh man, this is so lush. We have such amazing opportunities in front of us. Amazing opportunities. You're under no threat of physical violence, that I know of anyway. The other thing I would say to you is that godly living will bring persecution. And if it's not burning, you're probably doing it wrong. If it's not hurting, you're probably compromising. And I'd have you ask the Holy Spirit where that's at. And then honestly, this passage just isn't about us. And it'd be really unfair. This is not about how your boss doesn't like you because you always want Sundays off. That's not what this is about. These people were facing death. And I don't want to belittle what they're going through and what the church is going through today by comparing what we're going through to it. You ever had someone do that to you before? And they're like, yeah, you know. And they're trying to console, they're trying to connect, and they're like, yeah, I too lost a dog. And you're just like, what? I lost a kid, you know? It's like they're trying to connect, they're trying to console, and in the process, they're not honoring the grief that you're going through. These people died martyrs' deaths. And for me to talk jokingly about exercise and about your boss and how you don't think people like you, it's just not, they're not even in the same category. And it would be stupid for us to make it something about us. So here's what I want to do. This is how we're going to respond, because I don't know that some of these things could be applied to us. But here's how I'd like to respond today. We're going to pray for the persecuted church. We're going to remember our brothers and sisters who are in chains. On Thursday night at 6:30, we're going to gather. We're going to watch a documentary about the persecuted church. And then following the documentary, we're just going to pray. If you don't have a heart for this, come, because when you begin to pray, you gain a heart for stuff. We also wanted to take an offering today. In fact, the offering that we already took, we're going to give that to the church in Smyrna, because we have connections and relationships there. We have needs here. And again, it was really sobering this week, as I thought, well, we've got staff and we need a shade cover for the playground, and we need to restore an old building in Tulare, and we've got needs that we're faced with. And to remember what the church is facing in other countries was helpful for me this week. And so, yeah, we're going to take the offering and send it to these churches that we have relationship with in this region. I know you weren't told that to begin with, and you want to give more. So we'll just put the offering things, if you want to give above and beyond, because typically we give until it hurts. We don't usually give when it hurts. If you want to give above and beyond what you gave this morning, there'll be some offering baskets up front, and then there's a way to give online if you choose our designated fund. And we'll keep you reported on how much was raised and then what they were able to do with the money in the church in Turkey. And then the last thing we're going to do together to just unite ourselves to the body of Christ around the world is come to the table and remember Jesus' death and what he's done, that we can be faithful even when faced with hard stuff, because he was faithful and faced sin and death on our behalf. And so would you stand with me, and worship team, would you come? We thank you, Father. We thank you for the family, of God around the world. We thank you for this way of remembering what you've done and being connected to your body as we receive your body broken for us, your blood shed for us. We do pray for great grace to come on the churches of Turkey. We ask that you would comfort them. We ask that you'd sustain them. We ask that you'd give them what they need. And we ask that the gospel would continue to go forth there. Would you help us with our fears, and would you help us to be faithful, Lord? And everybody said, amen.
Thanks for listening. We want to be a resource for you as you walk with Jesus. So please connect with us at radiantvisalia.com. Until next time.
There is a heavenly city that I'm compelled to find. Oh, I love the flowers and trees and the smell of the grinding sea and all the beautiful things here in life. And I'm a pilgrim here on the side of the great divide.